So Shari Redstone, the owner of Paramount for now, right? She's the major controlling interest of National Amusements, which currently owns and controls Paramount, but they are going to be selling it to Skydance. But in her lame duck era at the head of this company, she has publicly come out in support of CBS anchor Tony Dokoupil for his controversial interview with the author Ta-Nehisi Coates. CBS, of course, is a subsidiary of Paramount Global. And here's what she had to say. Quote, "I frankly think Tony did a great job with that interview. I think he handled himself and showed the world a role model of what civil discourse is. He showed that there was accountability, that there was a system of checks and balances, and frankly, I was very proud of the work that he did," end quote. So here's some context. I try not to delve too much into political topics on the show, but I'm a very political person. I find this stuff fascinating. In another life, maybe I could have been a political strategist, but my problem is I have a conscience, so I don't know if that would have worked. So that's A, but then also B, when it intersects with media and entertainment, I feel like then it's kind of, I have the green light to do a story like this. So let me give you some context if you don't know what the hell I'm even talking about. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, pictured here, he's an American writer, journalist, activist, very well acclaimed, very well regarded, and he's been on the scene for years now, but he really gained attention for his writings on race in America in the 2010s. Specifically, his essay 2012's Fear of a Black President, and then he did an essay in 2014, The Case for Reparations. These were very controversial, polarizing articles, but they were really, I don't think you could condemn them as being superficial or clickbaity. Like, they were very thoughtful exploration of these ideas. And his most recent book is titled The Message, and it focuses on 3 trips that he's made. I don't know if it's just like in his life or recently, but one of them is recent, right? It focuses on 3 trips that he's made. One to Dakar in Senegal, one to, I'm going to mispronounce it, maybe Chapin in South Carolina, and then infamously the West Bank and East Jerusalem in Palestine and Israel, right? And the latter half of the book really focuses on that last trip, right? That trip to Israel in Palestine. And he's arguing in this book, in this section of the book, he's arguing against, quote, the elevation of factual complexity over self-evident morality, end quote. So this idea of certain topics that are quote, quote, complex aren't really complex. They are just made to seem complex by the people who stand to benefit from people not paying too much attention to the issue, right? Because you kind of throw up your hands and go, oh, this is too complicated to figure out, when in fact the situation is way more simpler and the morality is way more, as he says, self-evident. A New York Magazine profile said that the book was, quote, it says, the profile by New York Magazine says the book, quote, lays forth the case that the Israeli occupation is a moral crime, one that has been all but covered up by the West, end quote. And Coates went as far as saying, quote, I don't think I ever in my life felt the glare of racism burn stranger and more intense than in Israel, end quote. So very, very provocative, right? Because of course, despite the situation perhaps not being as complex people want to make it seem, it's very controversial. It's very polarizing, especially in the United States. So as part of this book, as authors do, they go on daytime talk shows and morning shows and to discuss the book. And he had this interview on CBS, and it was CBS Mornings with 3 hosts or journalists: Gayle King, Tony Dokoupil, and Nate Burleson. It's the video, if you go on YouTube, it's about, I think, like 6 or 7 minutes long. Tony Dokoupil, I think it's Nate Burleson, basically reads the intro, asks Coates an initial question, and then for the majority of it, it's just Tony Dokoupil. Kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, but kind of commandeering or kind of taking it hostage, so to speak, or rather, what's the word? I don't know what the word would be. Hijack. Kind of hijacks the conversation. And Gayle King, respected his, storied daytime television journalist Gayle King only gets like one question at the very, very end. And not only did Dokoupil kind of hijack the interview, his line of questioning was at best hostile and at worst antagonistic. He jumps right out and saying that the book, quote, reads like the work of an extremist, end quote. And the issue that I have with this interview is not that Dokoupil, because Dokoupil is very, very pro-Israel. He himself is Jewish. I believe he has children who live in Israel. So the issue isn't necessarily his pro-Israel stance. Here, the real issue is the failure of journalistic integrity, in my opinion. Because I didn't study journalism. I'm not a journalist, but I think they talk to you about like leading questions, right? And how they're not good, right? Whereas every single question Tony Dokoupil asked were leading questions, right? So here's a little blurb of what he says here, saying, quote, why leave out, in the book, why leave out that Israel's surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and second Intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel in any condition has a right to exist, end quote. That's very charged and very leading, right? And I think Coates, I believe he responds, I don't know if it's to that point specifically, but he, at some point in the interview, he even says, well, that perspective is already well represented in American media, but no one's really talking about, no one's really giving the Palestinians a voice. And that's why I'm not covering those things, because the book isn't about because he's like, the book isn't a treatise on Israel's right to exist. The book is about the way race and class create for segregated societies. So the way he sees it, and I don't want to jump ahead, but the way he sees it is basically the conditions in the West Bank, in Gaza, are not that far off from apartheid South Africa or the Jim Crow segregationist South in the United States. And Dokoupil, isn't even really asking interesting or probing questions. It's just filled with talking points, right? Again, like, Israel surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it. What about this? What about that? And it's usually, these statements aren't untrue. Like, those things are true. And I'll say unequivocally, violence is wrong no matter who does it. There's really never a situation, save for pure self-defense, and I'm talking about like a personal self-defense, that violence is, in my opinion, never acceptable. So, bus bombings in Israel are wrong. Cafe bombings are wrong. Little kids being blown up is wrong. Those are not untrue statements. But oftentimes, those facts are weaponized, usually to minimize or justify the abhorrent treatment of the Palestinians and minimize any potentiality of their own statehood or agency or anything like that. And those statements, because Coates isn't even talking about Hamas or terrorists. He's talking just about normal Palestinian people. So Dokoupil bringing up terrorist attacks, it is an effort, either conscious or subconscious. I want to give Dokoupil the benefit of the doubt here, but it's an effort to conflate Hamas with the Palestinian people. So when you do that, you can then treat the Palestinians writ large as if they're terrorists who just attacked you. Which also neglects the fact that Hamas and groups like it, despite me disagreeing with violence as a method, the positions Dokoupil's kind of pushing here in this interview, it neglects the fact that Hamas and groups like it rose up because of Israeli mistreatment. Whereas he's almost trying to frame it, we need to behave this way to the Palestinians because of the hostility, as if it's not the treatment that created the hostility in the first place. And Coates is like a pretty mild-mannered kind of guy from what I've seen. I've listened to an interview with him before. I've read a few of his I've read some of his stuff before. But from my understanding, he's like a pretty well-tempered, kind of mild guy. But by the end of this interview, he really unleashes. He doesn't get like angry and blows up, but you can feel him get a little more emotional, making sure that he's, being understood. And again, his response to the idea when he's asked, do you believe that Israel even has the right to exist? He basically says, no country in the world has ever existed because it had the right to exist. Israel, it's really inconsequential if it has the right or not. It exists. And it exists as a state built on ethnic stratification. And again, he compares Israel to apartheid and Jim Crow. He mentions this anecdote when he's in the West Bank or East Jerusalem or wherever he was in this anecdote. He mentions there's an instance of a man he met that told him he being the Palestinian man, he couldn't walk down the street, a certain street, without professing his religion. That feels eerily reminiscent of apartheid in Jim Crow, where, you couldn't walk on the street. If a white guy was walking down, you would have to get off the street and let him go by you. And Dokoupil, like I said, basically took over this interview. And later, Coates even acknowledged that really he didn't really feel as bad for himself, but he felt more bad for the other two journalists there, saying, quote, "I don't think he did Nate and Gail a service. I'm really, really sorry for them," end quote. So this kind of blew up, right? I don't want to say the word viral isn't really appropriate, but it really got a lot of attention. And CBS, the network, kind of came out, well, not came out publicly, but essentially within, I think it was like a staff meeting, they denounced Dokoupil's approach. And maybe denounce is too strong of a word, but they kind of acknowledged that the executives told the staffers that the interview, quote unquote, did not meet the network's editorial standards. And the New York Times notes that Dokoupil, regretted the situation. He spoke at this meeting, but he didn't necessarily apologize for what had happened. And Deadline notes a source told them that this isn't the first time concerns over Dokoupil's Israel bias have been raised by others as well as by the network. So you have a pretty, again, this was leaked, but even if it wasn't a public rebuke of him, clearly CBS felt it was necessary to tell their staff that, this isn't ideally the way we would want to go about something like this. And then Shari Redstone gets involved. So we're bringing it back to Shari Redstone. So she publicly rebuked this rebuke, right? She said, quote, "As hard as it was, frankly, for me to go against the company because I love this company and I believe in it, and I think we have a great, great executive team, I think they made a mistake here. I am not an executive, but I have a voice in our platform like all of us, and as you may know, I don't hesitate to use it," end quote. And it's notable because she rarely weighs in when it comes to internal matters like this. And Deadline notes that usually there is a wall between the corporate side of things and the news division. So, and if that makes sense, she's, a prominent Jewish, media, executive in the industry. So it makes sense that she would have strong enough opinions about this to kind of break that silence that normally she maintains when it comes to issues like this. So the reason why this story is so fascinating to me is, even the quote-unquote liberal media is still incredibly pro-Israel. I mean, I want to make it clear, and if people have questions or comments about my position on this, feel free to message me or comment on this, but, I have no problem with the Jewish people or the idea of a Jewish state, but the idea of an ethno-state predicated on essentially segregation feels wrong to me. And that Coates basically says as much. Again, this idea of issues are made to seem more complicated than they really are to benefit those who benefit from the status quo. And he basically says either ethnic segregation is right or it's wrong. And he says, I think I have a quote from him here. He basically says, there's nothing the Palestinians could do that would make that okay for me. The way that they're treated, it doesn't matter if every single man, woman, child is a serial killer that wants to kill every Jew in the world, right? He's saying there's nothing that they could do that would make their treatment justified. And again, so the quote-unquote liberal media is more than happy to support this, right? And, what the interview has done or the situation, rather, because not so much the interview, but the hostility of it, and then Coates pushing back, and it's raised all these questions. Coates has forced the media intelligentsia, if you will, to confront their own biases. We like to think in the liberal media, and I'm saying this as if like I'm conservative. If you know me, I'm very, very far left. I don't criticize Democrats because I'm with the Republicans. I criticize the Democrats because they're with the Republicans. So the liberal media, especially in like the post-Trump era, they have this very high and mighty kind of sanctimoniousness about how sacred their role is in terms of, the Washington Post's tagline is "Democracy dies in darkness," right? And all of that's true. But then at the same time, they will be more than happy to support a very conservative country doing very immoral things, right? And, for the media and for many quote-unquote liberals in the United States, Israeli security is non-negotiable. Palestinian security is absolutely negotiable. So in this war, for example, any Palestinian tragedies are regrettable, but they're not deal breakers. So, when there's a famine, Kamala Harris will come out and say, this is awful, we need to get food into Gaza, as if it's like a natural disaster that there's nothing we can do about. So they'll pay lip service to the tragedies happening, but those tragedies won't force anyone to reconsider or reevaluate their allegiances and their biases and their positions. And Dokoupil says in this interview that if you read this book, he's like, if you read this book just the way you've presented it, you'd think Israel's this awful place that shouldn't exist. And to that, I would say, well, if the facts lead you to that conclusion, because again, unless Coates is lying, this is just facts. So if the facts lead you to that conclusion, then that's the conclusion it leads you to. And it's only a problem if you've already decided consciously, or more likely subconsciously, that Israeli supremacy first is primary. And then you work out your rationalizations afterwards, right? And it just goes to show the hypocrisy of the liberal media, because they are, more than happy to support the Ukrainians in their fight to push against the Russians, which, I think is on the whole a pretty fair use of force, in the sense that they are literally just trying to stop invaders from taking over their country. But they will not extend the same support to Palestinian freedom fighters. We're only willing to support freedom fighters if it's geopolitically advantageous. And again, like Coates brought up, it reflects an inherent racism of the situation. This isn't, again, I'm going to paint with broad strokes, but Israel at the end of the day has a fairly large white European descended population for a country in the Middle East. And it also discounts the idea that it seems to ignore the fact that there are Palestinian Jews, right? This is not necessarily a religious, it's not completely religiously bifurcated. As well as Palestinian Muslims and also Palestinian Christians, right? And Dokoupil says, I think to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think he may have just misspoke. But at one point in the interview, he says, you're challenging Israel's right to exist. Well, why do the Palestinians have the right to exist? I'm assuming he just meant like a Palestinian state. But that's a really bad look, right? And it feels very dehumanizing to say, well, why does this group of people have the right to exist? So it's like a state has the right to exist, but not a group of people. And in the interview, he essentially victim blames them for their own oppression. In the interview, he's saying like, well, where's their place in this? Like, you just paint them as victims. Where's their role in this? Like, essentially saying like, if they wanted a better life, it's their fault. Like, they basically brought this on themselves. And again, Coates says, I don't know what they could have ever do to warrant what I saw, is what he says. So taking my own biases out of this, right? This kind of me talking about this and me having my own biases and positions on this reflects, I think, the last thing I want to talk about here. How should journalists approach any topic, right? I reject the idea that journalism can ever be completely objective, because every decision that you make as a journalist when you're writing a story is subjective. From as broad as choosing what stories to cover and not to cover, more usually is what happens. Is from there, also down to literally like what words to use when describing something. Even if everything in your article is factual, it's still from a subjective viewpoint, right? Rather, the goal should not be objectivity, but it should be fairness, right? If the facts lean to one side of an argument, then the facts just lead to one side of the argument. You know what I mean? I did not come up with this phrase, but I've been seeing a lot of people talk about this. If you're a journalist, if one side says it's raining and the other side says it's not raining, your job isn't to cover both sides. Your job is to go see if it's raining, right? So if the facts lead you to one specific position or opinion, then that's the facts lead you where they lead you. And my issue is not that Dokoupil editorialized. I just disagree. I just think he's wrong, right? That it's okay to have an opinion about these things because you're a human being as well. The issue is just that he's just wrong. And, I think one day Palestine will be free. And it'll be like South Africa, where it'll be this controversial, seemingly complicated topic until it isn't. And no one today is like, well, it's really complicated today that we did. It's now just a fact. And it's, I wouldn't say it's been perfect, but it was a lot easier, not the struggle to abolish apartheid, but rather the post-apartheid world was much simpler and easier than I'm sure people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s made it out to seem. So I think this is going to be another situation like that, where it's going to be controversial and polarizing until it isn't, and we'll all just move on and forget about all of this. But raises interesting questions about journalistic integrity. What does that even mean? And I highly encourage you all to go find this video of this interview. Because again, it's short. It's only maybe 6 or 7 minutes. Really, really interesting just to see, these two kind of forces go back and forth with one another. Wow, what an interesting story. I'm sure you have some thoughts about the topic, so comment below, let me know what you think. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really, really helps people find the channel and makes me feel all warm inside. Until next time, I'm Peter Mancuso. Peace out.